My sister once locked me in a flooding basement and now calls me unstable to hide it, but when I played my strongest card, her perfect image collapsed. My name is Eliza Kane. The power had gone out sometime after midnight. I couldn't tell exactly when. It wasn't like I'd been sleeping peacefully. My brain had been half awake for hours, turning over useless thoughts and trying to tune out the heavy hum of the lavender diffuser my sister insisted I run every night. "It'll help you relax," she'd said, slipping the plug into the outlet like she was doing me a favor. At first, I thought the dripping I heard was coming from the kitchen sink. Then I realized it was too slow, too deliberate, like water finding its way through wood. The room felt heavy, a dampness clung to the sheets. I swung my legs off the bed and stepped onto the floor. It was cold, wetter than it should have been. I reached for my phone. No bars, dead screen, of course. I shuffled to the hallway and blinked. The baseboards were bleeding water, just a thin stream, but growing. The carpet squished underfoot, and the only light in the house came from occasional flashes of lightning slicing across the living room. I could hear the river again. Or maybe it was the bayou. Either way, it was louder than it had ever been. I grabbed the flashlight from the hall drawer, the one Sable kept stocked with batteries like she was always preparing for a disaster. She told me once, if something ever happens, don't wait. Go straight to the basement. The sump pump will keep us safe. Those words echoed in my ears as I made my way to the basement door. I flipped the latch and opened it slowly. A heavy mustiness hit me, that smell you can't quite name: mold, old dirt, wet concrete. The air felt like it had weight. I descended the stairs slowly, one step at a time. My light cut through the darkness in sharp angles. The basement looked normal. No panic yet, just wet walls. The pump was quiet. Then it happened. A metallic click, sharp, decisive, from behind me. I turned instinctively, racing back up 2 steps, but the door had slammed shut. My hand reached the knob. I twisted. Nothing. I pushed. Still nothing. I twisted again, harder. It rattled but didn't budge. No. My heart dropped into my stomach. I banged on the door. Sable? No answer. Sable? Still nothing. I pounded harder, fist to wood, then shoulder to door. Let me out. Water dripped down from the staircase above, cold and relentless. I pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing but storm, and that's when I saw it. The flashlight beam swept across the inside of the door. A glint. A flash. The edge of a padlock, new, clean, drilled into the frame. I blinked hard. The same door that had always opened freely was now sealed from the outside. Who the hell had locked it? No. Who else would have locked it? It was new. I knew the basement like the back of my hand. That wasn't there yesterday. It couldn't have been. A different kind of fear spread through my chest. Not the fear of water, not yet, but the fear of knowing something had changed, and I wasn't meant to know it. I started to shake, not because of the cold, though there was plenty of that, but because everything in my body wanted to scream, run, escape, but there was no place to go. I pulled my phone again, still dead. No charger, no backup. That wasn't allowed in the house anymore, not for me at least. The water on the floor had risen. It was now at my shins. The sump pump remained silent. I checked the switch. Dead. I screamed again. Somebody, please. I'm locked in. I reached the only window in the basement, too small to crawl through, just a slit near the ceiling facing the backyard. The rain pelted it like bullets. My flashlight flickered once, then held steady. That's when I knew I couldn't rely on anything but myself. I dragged over a box, then another, stacking them until I could reach the vent above the window. I stood, knees wobbling, and pressed my mouth to the metal slits. Help! I'm in here, please. Silence. Then voices, garbled. Outside, a shout. Movement. I banged the metal with the flashlight. Down here. I'm down here. A beam of light cut across the backyard, and then footsteps. My body tensed. Was it her? Sable? I whispered. No reply. Just a low voice, male. You hear that? My heart slammed against my ribs. I leaned closer to the vent. I'm locked in the basement. I screamed. Help, ma'am, a voice called. Can you repeat that? I didn't hesitate. My sister locked me in the basement. She wants me dead. There was a pause. I heard another voice, calmer but closer. Keep talking to me. All right. You're going to be okay. I sank to my knees, sobbing. For the first time, someone had heard me, not the version Sable curated, not the troubled teen narrative. Me. The water touched the bottom of the boxes. The air smelled metallic. The light outside bounced, flickered, then steadied again. Footsteps scrambled up the side of the house. Then the sound of a walkie-talkie crackling. One man shouted, "We've got a visual. Basement window. Partial blockage." Another answered, "Get the gear." She said it's locked from the outside. I let my head rest against the vent. The rain poured harder, but my words, my truth, had finally pierced the storm. I held my breath, ears straining. The creak of the door hadn't come from inside, and it hadn't come from me. It was deliberate, slow, controlled, like someone didn't want to be heard but didn't care if I knew. That was worse. I froze, barely above water, crouched by the vent where I'd last screamed. A shape passed outside the narrow window, a blur low to the ground. It was gone before I could catch more than a shadow. I didn't call out this time. I'd learned when to be loud and when silence was safer. My legs were cramping, soaked. The water had crept past my knees now. Each shift sent a ripple through the murky flood around me. I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on that corner of the room like it might move again. When nothing did, I slid against the wall and tried to breathe without choking on the thick, wet air. Then, out of nowhere, the past crashed into me like my body couldn't keep the memory locked down anymore. It wasn't the first time I'd been trapped down there. 6 months ago, I tried telling someone. It had taken me weeks to work up the courage to say it aloud, to tell an adult, any adult, that Sable had locked me in the basement once before. My hands had been shaking when I sat down in front of Ms. Durney, the school counselor. She was kind, at least I thought she was. She handed me tissues before I'd even said a word. But I did tell her. I told her everything I could manage between shallow breaths and too much shame. I think my sister's not safe for me, I'd whispered. Ms. Durney had nodded slowly, eyes soft behind her big round glasses. What makes you say that, Eliza? So I told her about the day it first happened. It was a Tuesday, my birthday. I was 12. I'd forgotten to clean the kitchen like I promised, and I knew she'd be mad, but I didn't expect what came next. Sable walked in while I was setting the table for my own cake. Mom wasn't home. Dad had already bailed years ago. It was just the two of us that afternoon, and I remember her voice being weirdly sweet. "Come here," she said, smiling too hard. "I left something in the basement for you." A surprise. I blinked. A surprise? Yeah, but you have to close your eyes. It's tradition. I knew better. I knew better. But I wanted it to be real. I wanted one day, one birthday, where she wasn't awful. So I went. I even smiled a little. She walked behind me as I headed down. Then the door slammed, loud, final. I screamed. Of course I did. I kicked the door, begged. She didn't come back for 8 hours. When she did, she tossed me a peanut butter sandwich and said, "You could have gotten out. You're just too lazy to try." When I told my mother later, she didn't even lift her eyes from her magazine. "Eliza, you've always had an active imagination. Don't dramatize." That night, I wrote it all down in my notebook. Then I tore the page out and burned it in the backyard, because I didn't want anyone to find it, because part of me believed it was my fault too. After I told Ms. Durney all of this, she nodded again. She said she'd talk to my sister. I asked her not to, but she insisted it was protocol. The next morning, Sable showed up at school in her nicest sweater, her makeup perfectly smudged to look like she'd been crying. She sat in the front office talking softly with the principal. By the time I was called in, she was already painting the story. She's been acting out at home, Sable said. Since our dad left, she hasn't been herself. I'm scared she might hurt herself, or someone else. The counselor's face dropped. We had no idea. Of course they didn't. Sable was a professional at this. By lunch, I was suspended for disruptive false accusations and concerning behavior. I spent the rest of the week in my room, no phone, no internet, just Sable knocking on my door at odd times to whisper, "Keep talking, and next time it won't be 8 hours. Now, knee-deep in rising water, I remembered that moment with an eerie sense of déjà vu. And yet this time something was different. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel crazy. I felt awake. The water lapped against my thighs. The air grew thinner, more humid. I stood slowly, pushing soaked hair from my eyes. My flashlight was nearly dead, just a soft circle of glow left. But I could still move, still think. There was no way I was dying down here. Not today. Not for her. I scanned the room, mentally cataloging everything I could use: shelves, boxes, the old laundry sink in the far corner. My phone, useless in my back pocket now, soaked through in dead weight. My voice was shot from yelling. The walls didn't echo. Everything in that basement felt designed to muffle, to contain. I knew Sable. She thought of everything, she always had. But she also underestimated people, especially me. I climbed onto the old desk we used to store holiday junk. The water was now up to its legs. I could feel it tilting slightly beneath me. I braced one hand on the pipe overhead and forced myself to think. What would I do if this weren't happening to me? What if I were reading about a girl trapped like this? She wouldn't waste time begging. She'd find a way to leave a message, a trail. That's when I remembered the journals, the ones I kept hidden behind the boiler just in case. The first was gone. I was sure Sable had burned it when she found it last spring. But the second, that one she never saw. I had wrapped it in plastic and tucked it into the vent behind the old heater. I remembered how careful I was, double knotting the bag like I'd never need it. Now I needed it more than air. I scanned the wall. There, in the far corner above the rising water, the old vent cover still held, rusted but closed. If I could reach it. I dropped down into the flood and waited, pushing through the cold, gasping as it hit my ribs. I gripped the pipe along the wall and pulled myself toward the far end, using shelves and cabinets for balance. The vent was closer now. I reached it, standing on the edge of a crate, my arms barely long enough to get a grip. I tugged once, twice. The metal creaked, it gave. I reached in. Nothing deeper. My fingers brushed plastic. Yes. I pulled the bag free. It was soaked but intact. The journal inside still legible through the wrapping. I exhaled, pressing it to my chest. I wasn't done yet. I looked back toward the ceiling vent where I had screamed my truth and where someone, somewhere, had heard me. Even with the journal pressed to my chest, water sloshing at my ribs and my legs trembling from cold, I couldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, not anymore. It was something else. Something close to fury. It was the kind of rage that simmers under survival, the kind that makes your hands steady when everything around you is falling apart. I didn't move right away. I let the storm breathe. I listened for that shadow again. Whoever had passed outside the window, but nothing came. The air grew heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The bag in my hands felt heavier than it should have. Maybe because it wasn't just plastic and wet paper. It was proof. Truth written in my own words, the kind of truth no one had listened to the first time, or the second, or the 10th. I wiped water from my face, not sure whether it was rain or tears anymore. Then I turned toward the wall behind me, searching for somewhere, anywhere, safe enough to place it. Somewhere it could be found if I didn't make it out. I wasn't being dramatic. That thought didn't come from a place of weakness. It was just math. The water kept rising. If the power was out and the sump pump was dead and no one opened that door in time, then math would win. Still clutching the journal, I climbed onto the floating desk again. The legs wobbled beneath me, one already buckling slightly from the pressure. I held onto a pipe for balance, keeping the journal high above my head. Scanning the corners of the basement ceiling, I spotted a narrow vent above the breaker box, barely wide enough to shove the journal into, but just high enough that the water couldn't reach it. Not yet. I inched toward it slowly, using my elbows and one knee to stay steady. Then I reached out and wedged the journal inside the vent shaft. My fingers lingered on the bag for a second longer than necessary, like part of me wasn't ready to let it go. But I did, and just like that, it was out of my hands. I slid back down to the top of the desk, which now dipped dangerously with each movement. Then I saw something drift by me in the water, a torn page, just one. It floated lazily, as if it had been waiting. I leaned down and caught it before it could pass. The ink had blurred, but one sentence remained readable: "If I disappear, it's not by choice." My breath hitched. That was mine. I'd written that 2 months ago, the same night I hid the journal. I remembered scribbling it after one of Sable's little performances in front of Mom, after she'd convinced her I was having another episode and needed more structure. "You're lucky to have a sister like Sable," Mom had said that night. "She's doing everything she can to keep you stable." Stable. Structured. Silenced. I tucked the floating page into the band of my soaked jeans. I didn't know if it would survive the night, but I couldn't let it go either. My fingers had started to prune. My teeth were chattering, and yet my mind felt clearer than it had in weeks, months, maybe. I hadn't planned for tonight. I wasn't psychic. But I had known something was coming. The way Sable watched me had shifted. Her smiles had gotten tighter, her words more rehearsed. She'd started dropping lines like, "You think people are going to believe you, Eliza, and you keep pushing, and you're going to end up hurting yourself, or worse." She never screamed, never hit. She didn't have to. She knew exactly how to make people like me look unstable. I'd spent too many hours replaying that birthday in my head, the one when she first locked me in the basement. I thought it was a fluke, a moment of cruelty she'd later pretend never happened. But cruelty, I'd learned, was a habit, not a phase. And now, in the dead of night, with the rain pounding the roof and the floor beneath me steadily vanishing, it all made sense. She had set this up piece by piece: the new padlock, the missing charger, the coincidental power outage. Even the smell of lavender that made me groggy, something I thought was comforting, now tasted like control. I thought about the time she asked me, with that too sweet voice, "What would you do if you had to start over?" I said something dumb like, "I don't know. I'd probably write it all down first." And she had smiled as if that was exactly what she'd hoped I'd say. I looked back toward the vent where the journal now sat hidden. I whispered to myself, not for comfort, but for focus. "They're going to find it. They have to." Outside, thunder cracked again. A flash of light illuminated the window just enough for me to see movement, a flashlight beam. It danced across the glass, then disappeared. I sat up straighter, heart pounding again. Voices, real this time. Basements around back. They said the door's sealed. I wanted to scream, but I'd used my voice too many times already. So instead, I pressed my hands to the wall as if my skin could carry the message. "I'm here." 1 minute passed, then another. Water reached my chest. I heard footsteps thudding above me, fast and heavy. Then a bang. And another. Metal against wood. A crowbar, maybe. My body was shaking from cold now. I didn't try to stop it. Then silence. Footsteps again, closer. The door handle rattled. "Eliza," a voice called. "Are you there?" I blinked hard, too scared to answer, not because I didn't trust the voice, but because I couldn't believe it was real. "Eliza, we've got you," the voice said again. "We're opening the door. Just hold on." I wanted to say something, anything. But all I managed was a whisper, "The journal. It's in the vent. Don't let her lie again." The door cracked. And then the brightest light I'd seen in hours poured into the room. I kept my back pressed against the cinderblock wall, water lapping just below my shoulders. Even though the flashlight beams had faded from view, I knew someone had been there. The sound of boots scraping against gravel, the way the window had glowed for just a heartbeat, it wasn't in my head. Someone was close. I stayed still, listening. The vent above the staircase creaked again. Then, faintly, the thud of car doors, shouting, not angry, but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but they weren't hers. That was enough to make me stay alert. And then a voice, gravelly, older, familiar. She doesn't swim. I taught Sable, not her. Don't listen to their nonsense. If that girl's still in the house, she's not fine. Mr. Derry. My throat clenched. Of all the neighbors, he was the one Sable warned me to stay away from. He was too nosy, she said. Too dramatic. He made up stories, claimed he saw things no one else did. But he saw me. Really saw me. Not the version my sister curated for teachers, church ladies, or mom's book club. He used to bring over old gardening books when I was a kid and show me pictures of native plants. You grow where you're allowed to, he'd say, and where you're not. Sometimes you just bust through the concrete. I almost smiled thinking about it, until another voice cut through the air like a blade. Tell me where my niece is. A woman shouted, soaked, winded. The kind of voice you don't ignore, not because it's loud, but because it means every word it says. My heart skipped. Aunt Lenore, that voice had once read me bedtime stories. She was the only one who ever asked how I was feeling without making it sound like an accusation. She disappeared 2 years ago, not literally, but Sable had stopped letting her in. Said Lenore made me unstable. Said she was poisoning the house with her energy. My mother had agreed. We don't need her drama, she'd whispered one night, pouring wine at the kitchen counter. She means well, but she brings trouble. Lenore brought truth. That's what they couldn't stand. Outside, her voice came again, sharp and direct. You have teams pulling garbage out of the creek, but no one's checked the damn basement. The air shifted. Something was happening. I pushed off the wall and waded toward the staircase, dragging my numb legs through the weight of the flood. It was harder to move now. Furniture floated into new positions. Debris clung to my clothes. Above me, footsteps pounded across the floor, then halted. More voices, closer. She's right. This door is not jammed. It's locked from the outside. Another man, younger, frantic, over here, there's a vent. Someone's been trying to shout through it. And then I heard the clink of tools, the scrape of metal on wood. A breath caught in my throat. That sound, real help. Not another lie, not another trap disguised as rescue, not another sister's voice pretending to cry. I didn't cry. Not this time. I pulled myself back toward the desk and climbed to where I'd hidden the journal. My fingers traced the edge of the vent, now slightly warped from the damp. I whispered to it, not because I thought it could hear, but because I needed to say it out loud. Find this. Please let someone believe it. The thudding above grew louder, grunts, labored effort, then a crack. The door began to splinter. I heard someone curse under their breath, the kind of honest frustration that only comes when something actually needs breaking. Eliza, a voice called out, male, unfamiliar, but grounded. If you can hear me, back away from the door. We're getting you out. I backed toward the corner, hands still shaking. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer, so I tapped the pipe twice, loud, steady, then silence. One final slam and the door cracked open. A burst of light flooded the basement, making me flinch. My eyes stung. A firefighter stepped in, water to his thighs. His expression was equal parts disbelief and urgency. Got her, he shouted. She's here. I didn't move, not until another man followed, wearing a navy raincoat, and said, it was locked from the outside, just like she said. Just like I said. They lifted me out gently, voices calm, no false sympathy, just action. Someone threw a blanket around my shoulders. My ears rang. I caught snippets, she was trapped. Doesn't line up with the family's statement. Journal in the vent. I tried to nod. One of them must have found it already. Or maybe they would. They carried me out onto the lawn. The storm had lightened, but the air was thick with leftover chaos, radios, radio chatter, flashing lights. I blinked against the wind, and there she was. Sable. standing on the porch in my hoodie 008, her arms folded like she'd just come back from a jog. Her expression was picture-perfect concern, but her eyes, they told the truth. They always had. I just hadn't been strong enough to say it out loud before. Behind her, Mom hovered like a ghost, mouthing something to a responder, probably explaining how her fragile daughter had gotten herself stuck, how I had episodes. But something shifted, because people were watching now, not just glancing, looking, really looking. One of the officers pointed at the lock. Fresh install from the outside. Screws still have silver dust. Sable's eyes flicked toward it, then back to me. She opened her mouth, probably to spin another version of the story. And that's when Lenner stepped between us. Not this time, she said, calm, clear, resolute. You've talked enough. Sable flinched, just barely. The EMTs guided me toward the ambulance. As they took my vitals, I saw another firefighter holding the journal. He held it like it mattered, like it meant something. And for once, it did. This wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't alone. By the time sunlight broke through the bedroom window of the hospital room, I was already awake. Not because I'd had a restful sleep, my body was too sore, too stiff, too full of images that wouldn't let me rest, but because my mind had moved to a different gear. Survival mode had ended. The real work was just beginning. A nurse I didn't recognize, short, kind eyes, quiet voice, came in around 7:15. She adjusted the foredrip and checked the monitor. You're lucky, sweetheart, she said softly. Water that cold, that long, could have done a lot more damage. I nodded, still watching the ceiling. Lucky wasn't the word I'd use, but I wasn't going to waste energy correcting people today. As she moved around the room, I heard murmurs from the hallway, something about the police, something about the mother not cooperating. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen Mom yet. Not once. Not that I expected her to come rushing in. The nurse left with a pat on my shoulder. I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of the chair near the door and the man sitting there watching me. Not a doctor, not family, something colder, more alert. Detective Garcia, he said after a pause. You're safe. We're not here to interrogate you, but I do have some questions when you're ready. I appreciated the tone, no babying, no fake warmth. He handed me a small notebook and said, whenever you feel like writing down anything, details, things you remember, this is for you. You don't have to talk if you're not ready. I took it, more grateful for the silence that followed than anything else. The door opened again. I turned toward it instinctively and froze. Sable, hair pulled back, no makeup, a sweatshirt a size too large. She looked soft, harmless. She looked like someone's big sister who just found out her sibling had been in an accident. She let out a sharp, shaky breath, one that sounded perfectly rehearsed. Eliza, she whispered, her voice cracking. Oh my God, I've been so worried. Detective Garcia straightened, stepped back half a foot to give her room, but didn't leave. He watched. Studied. I said nothing. She took a step closer, glancing toward the nurse's station before leaning in. I didn't know, she said quietly, eyes damp. They told me you went down to check the breaker, and I didn't, I said, cutting her off. My voice surprised me, clear, steady, loud enough to silence the rest of the room. Detective Garcia shifted slightly, just enough to let me know he was listening. I never touched the breaker, I added. I was asleep. I woke up to water in my room. Then I went down, and the door locked behind me. Sable blinked slowly. You think I did that? She whispered. Eliza, I know you did. She didn't flinch. Just stared at me like I'd just slapped her. Eliza, she said again, gentler, coaxing. You're confused. It's okay. You've been under a lot of stress. Garcia interrupted then. Miss Dorian, I'll have to ask you to step outside for a moment. She turned on the tears instantly. Please, she's my sister. He didn't blink. And you're not under arrest yet, but you're not her doctor and you're not her lawyer. So unless she's asking for you, you're leaving. That was when she finally broke character just a bit. Her jaw clenched. She turned and walked out, head down, hand clutching her phone like it might offer her an escape route. The door clicked shut behind her. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Garcia gave me a look, flat, unreadable. She's good. She's practiced, I corrected. He nodded once. We'll be back. I was alone again. For a while it was quiet, save for the occasional beep of the monitor, but not for long. Voices rose outside my room again. I recognized one, sharp, shrill, cracking under pressure. My mother. She said it was just to teach her a lesson, Mom told someone. That's all. She didn't say she locked her in. She said Eliza just got scared and overreacted. I closed my eyes. She's always been emotional, she continued. You know how teenagers are. They imagine things. Mrs. Kane. Garcia's voice cut through her ramble like a razor. There was a lock on the outside of the basement door, installed recently, with no interior mechanism. That doesn't happen by accident. There was a pause. Then, softer, I heard my mother sigh. I didn't think she meant harm. I thought she was just trying to keep Eliza safe. You don't understand how much pressure Sable's been under. She nearly drowned. That silenced the hallway. I rolled onto my side, pulling the blanket tighter. 10 minutes later, the door opened again, not Sable, not Mom. Garcia again, this time holding something in his hand, a laptop. We got a warrant, he said simply. This was in your sister's room. He sat beside the bed and opened the screen. We found a folder labeled insurance. Inside were PDF files, fake therapist reports, mental health assessments, a fake letter from a clinic that doesn't exist. All of them paint you as unstable, depressive, emotionally manipulative. One even suggested you'd made suicidal threats. I didn't answer. They're dated weeks before the flood, he added. And she never showed these to any school, doctor, or court. It was just there, hidden, for leverage. Still, I said nothing. There are also emails, he continued, scrolling, to a friend named Dana, talking about how she needs to control the narrative before you ruin everything. She mentioned the insurance policy in one. He didn't say the amount. I didn't ask. Instead, I looked at the screen, at the open inbox with subject lines like control her and she's not going to win. She planned it, I said finally. Garcia didn't nod, didn't agree or disagree. I want her gone, I added. Not just out of my room, out of my life. He closed the laptop and stood. We're working on it. As he reached the door, he paused. You're not crazy, Eliza. I know people probably told you that 1,000 times, but they were wrong. I didn't say thank you, but something in my chest loosened just a bit. He left, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove I wasn't the problem. They thought I was broken, an unstable, emotional girl who would eventually retreat into silence. But what they didn't see coming was that once you stop trying to convince people you're not the problem, you free up a lot of energy to actually fight. I was discharged later that morning, only after 3 separate evaluations and some intense persuading from Detective Garcia. The hospital insisted on sending me home with a trauma specialist's number, a stack of printed resources I knew I'd never read, and a paper bag with my torn jeans and hoodie. I changed in silence, breathing deep, moving slow. My muscles still ached, but my mind was sharper than ever. By the time we pulled into the driveway of the Kane house, 2 marked patrol cars were already parked out front. Their presence didn't rattle me. What did shake me briefly was seeing my little brother Noah sitting on the porch steps with his knees drawn to his chest, eyes darting between officers and his own shoelaces. He looked small, smaller than I remembered. But not because he'd shrunk. I think I just started seeing clearly. Detective Garcia opened his door and gave me a quiet nod. This is your show now, he said. Say what you need. We'll handle the rest. I stepped out slowly. The humidity hit me like a wall. Louisiana air always carried weight, but today it felt heavier than the flood itself. As I made my way toward the porch, Noah spotted me and stood up so fast he nearly tripped. Eliza, he whispered. I stopped a few feet from him. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he blurted it out, just like that. I saw her do it. That night. I blinked. What? He swallowed hard, eyes darting to the front door. I saw Sable go to the basement. I was in the hallway. She had the screwdriver and that dumb new lock she said was for the shed. He stopped, voice cracking. She told me if I said anything, she'd tell Mom I was the one who broke her laptop. He continued, barely above a whisper. She said no one would believe me anyway. He looked up at me with guilt so raw it almost knocked the breath out of me. I'm sorry. For a moment I wanted to wrap my arms around him, tell him it wasn't his fault. But instead I took a slow breath and said the one thing he needed to hear. You just did the right thing. Behind us, one of the officers nodded and walked toward the house. The other stayed back, watching. Noah sat again, pulling his knees tighter. I let him be. Inside, everything felt too clean, too staged, Sable's handiwork. Candles still sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. The floor had been mopped, the windows were open to let the smell of bleach out. No one cleaned like that unless they had something to erase. Mom was in the living room, arms crossed, wearing that expression she reserved for things she didn't want to deal with. I didn't speak to her, not yet. Instead, I followed Garcia down the hall toward Sable's room, where two officers were already sifting through drawers and lifting loose floorboards. One of them held something up, a cream-colored envelope, neatly sealed. This yours? He asked. I nodded before I even read it. The handwriting was mine, my name, my old school's address. He handed it to me. I stared at the stamp, unmarked, no post office date. I tore it open with shaky fingers. It was the transfer request. 2 months ago I'd filled it out after a particularly cruel dinner. Sable had called me a burden, told me I was ruining Mom's health, that maybe it was time I found a place better suited for people like you. I'd written the letter that night, asked to move in with Aunt Lenore, typed it on the old computer, printed it, sealed it, and left it on the kitchen table for Mom. She'd never mentioned it. And now here it was, unopened, hidden in Sable's drawer. She stopped it before I could even leave, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Garcia gave me a glance, no pity, just understanding. I turned and walked back into the living room. Mom was still standing there. She didn't ask where I'd gone. Didn't ask what I'd found. I stepped in front of her and held up the envelope. Did you know? I asked. Her lips pressed into a line. Did you see this? I said louder. Still no answer. I lowered my hand. You did? She didn't look at me, just stared past me like I was someone else's problem. I exhaled. Then you don't get to tell my story anymore. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't need one. Back in the dining room, Garcia motioned for me to sit at the table. A small recorder already sat on the wood. He pulled out a chair and placed a notepad beside it. Whenever you're ready, he said. I sat, adjusted the chair, took a breath, then I spoke. I was asleep when the storm started, I began, voice even. The power had gone out, but I didn't think much of it. When I woke up, water was already coming through the carpet. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs to check the sump pump. I didn't pause. She was waiting, not physically, but the lock. She'd installed it the day before. I didn't notice. I didn't know. My voice didn't tremble, not once. She knew I'd go down there. She made sure I couldn't come back up. Garcia scribbled a note, then looked up. You believe she wanted you to die? I didn't blink. She wanted me gone. And if dying made that easier, I think she was okay with it. He nodded once, then gestured toward the notebook. Anything else? I reached into my backpack and handed him a folded piece of paper, a copy of the journal page, the one that read, if I disappear, it's not by choice. She wanted to make sure I had no way out, I said. But I found one. He looked at the page, and this time he did nod. We sat in silence for a few seconds before he turned off the recorder. No more whispers, Eliza. I nodded. No more. The officer's voice echoed in my head long after he left the room. She tried to erase your voice, but forgot that evidence echoes louder than lies. I had replayed it over and over in my mind as I sat in the back of the squad car that afternoon, parked in front of the precinct's side entrance, waiting for them to prep the evidence room. The air conditioner in the cruiser blew too cold, and yet I didn't ask them to turn it down. I welcomed the chill. It helped me stay present, grounded. By the time the sun dipped behind the courthouse steeple across the street, we were already walking into the narrow side hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Detective Garcia walked just a step ahead of me. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. My hands were steady, my spine straight. This wasn't like before, when I told the school counselor Sable had locked me in the basement years ago, and they'd responded by calling her in for a check-in, when my mother whispered, "She's always been dramatic," like I wasn't even in the room. This time we had something they couldn't talk over. This time the room would listen. Inside the evidence viewing chamber, 3 officers stood already, one of them holding a flash drive the size of a fingertip. "He just walked in," the officer said, nodding toward Garcia. "Didn't say much, just handed it over and said you'll want to see this." "Who?" Garcia asked. "Neighbor," the officer replied. "Older guy, white hair. Said his cameras caught some strange behavior around the Kane house, especially at night." My breath caught. Mr. Derry, of course. Sable had always complained he was nosy, that he was one step away from losing it. But what she really meant was he noticed too much. The officer slid the flash drive into the laptop, and the first file opened. The room fell silent. The footage began from 2 weeks before the flood, midnight clips, timestamped and labeled. Grainy video, yes, but enough detail to feel it in your bones. There she was, Sable, wearing her favorite gray hoodie, the one with the university crest she never earned, standing in our backyard. The motion sensor lights flicked on, she didn't flinch. In one clip she yanked the blinds in the living room down aggressively after glancing outside, eyes scanning. In another she stood on the back porch, arms crossed, watching the window that led into my bedroom. She stood there for nearly 3 full minutes before turning and disappearing inside. "She's patrolling," one officer muttered. "She's not checking for intruders. She's checking for witnesses." Another video showed her in the middle of the night, creeping through the yard with a screwdriver in hand. Her face was calm, precise. She opened the basement door, walked down the steps, then returned and closed it, locked it, checked it twice. No rush, no fear of being seen. "She doesn't look like someone dealing with a mental health crisis," the officer beside me said flatly. "She looks like someone executing a plan." Garcia nodded, then clicked to the final file, the one labeled Flood Night 2:12 a.m. And then I saw it. Sable standing by the shed in her boots, hair pulled into a low braid. Rain poured around her. She wasn't wearing a raincoat. She didn't even look wet. She walked across the backyard with calm, measured steps. The wind blew her braid to one side. She didn't look at the house. She went straight to the basement door, opened it, held it open. The image shook slightly. Mr. Derry must have bumped the camera, but it was clear. Clear enough to see her lips move as she said something I couldn't hear. She looked around once, then closed the door, pulled something from her pocket, a lock. She slid it into place, clicked it shut, turned her back, and walked away without a glance behind her. The audio picked up one thing, faint but unmistakable. My voice, a scream, cut off the moment the door shut. The room was so still I could hear someone breathing 3 feet away. Then, quietly, one of the younger officers said, "That wasn't neglect." Garcia didn't blink. "That was intent." I didn't cry. Instead I stared at the screen until the image burned behind my eyes. She had known what she was doing. She had planned every part of it, and she had done it with a calmness that would terrify most people. But not me, because I had lived it. I turned to Garcia. "What now?" "We bring her in," he said. "This takes it from reckless endangerment to premeditated." A pause. Then he added, "She's going to lose everything." I shook my head. "She already lost me." They brought her into the station later that evening, not with handcuffs yet, but with a level of tension that changed the temperature of the room the moment she walked in. Sable still wore that same gray hoodie. Her face looked pale under the fluorescent lights, like maybe, just maybe, she knew the mask was slipping. When she spotted me sitting across the room, she hesitated. For half a second her mouth parted, like she might cry or plead or spin one more beautiful lie. But she didn't speak, and neither did I. Garcia stepped forward and asked her to take a seat. "We have video footage," he said simply. She blinked. "Footage of what?" "Of you locking the basement door." Her eyes flicked to me, then back to him. "I never." He held up a hand. "You don't have to say anything. In fact, I'd suggest you don't." For once, she listened. I watched her face as the truth landed, not all at once, not like a slap, more like a slow sinking, like a flood in reverse, dragging everything down. Her shoulders lowered, her mouth closed. No tears, no performance, just the quiet understanding that it was over. She tried to erase my voice, but the cameras remembered everything. The echo of the footage haunted the room even after the screen went black. No one spoke, not Garcia, not the tech team, not even the clerk who had been tapping away at his keyboard until that last recording ended. Sable's face, cold, calculated, lingered in everyone's mind like a shadow that refused to leave. The click of the padlock, the deliberate turn of her back, the absence of hesitation. When they finally escorted me out of the evidence room and into the hallway, the sun had started dipping below the courthouse roof. The air outside had that strange heaviness of early evening in Baton Rouge, moisture hanging midair like an unspoken thought. Garcia leaned over and whispered, "They're filing formal charges within the hour." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The word relieved didn't fit. Nothing about this felt clean or victorious. 3 weeks passed between that moment and the courtroom, 3 weeks filled with interviews, statements, subpoenas, and silence from people who used to praise Sable's ambition and charisma. Suddenly they didn't remember what she said at the church fundraiser or who she posed with at the neighborhood barbecue. Selective amnesia is a powerful thing in small towns. But not everyone stayed quiet. It was Officer Daniels, one of the first responders during the flood, who lit the final match. "We're trained to spot patterns," he said on the stand, his voice steady. And she didn't look like a girl caught in a flood. She looked like someone who had been left in a cell. I sat in the back row with Leonard beside me, fingers laced together tightly in my lap. Noah sat on my other side, knees bouncing. He hadn't said a word all morning. Daniels continued. "I've seen neglect. I've seen panic. This wasn't either." The judge asked him to clarify, and he did, clearly, simply. This was premeditated. That report was what cracked open the case wide enough for the jury to stop squinting and start seeing. Then came the evidence. They started with the body cam recording, the faint, gasping voice, "My sister wants me dead." Followed by the calm reply from the firefighter, "We're coming, Eliza. Hold on." Then they moved to the journal entries, pages stained, words smudged, but still legible. My words, my handwriting. "She's building a case against me, and no one's stopping her." Then came the emails. Prosecutor Sharp, a woman with ice in her voice and steel in her spine, held up a printed chain. "In this message," she said, addressing the jury, "Sable Dorian writes to a friend, she's going to slip eventually. I just need to make sure no one questions the narrative when it happens." She let that hang in the air a beat longer than necessary. Next was the camera footage, the crown jewel, the one no one could explain away. Sable's attorney tried. They said she was checking for water damage, securing the home, doing her due diligence, that the scream caught in the audio could have come from a neighbor, that the lock had been misunderstood. Sharp didn't flinch. "This wasn't an accident," she said during closing arguments. "This wasn't a mistake. This was an execution delayed by rain." The courtroom was so still I could hear someone shift in their seat 2 rows back. When the jury left to deliberate, Leonard finally exhaled beside me. I hadn't even realized she'd been holding her breath. It took them 4 hours. When they returned, their faces were tight. Some avoided looking toward the defense table. Others didn't bother. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge adjusted his glasses before speaking. "You were trusted to protect," he said, staring at Sable. "You chose to punish. This court finds you guilty of attempted murder, felony endangerment, and criminal fraud. You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in state custody without the possibility of parole." Sable didn't react, not at first. No gasp, no tears. She just stared. I'd seen that look before, when we were children and I'd caught her stealing Mom's wedding ring from the jewelry box. She'd stared at me like that then too, blank, not defiant, not ashamed, just gone. That was the last time I saw her. She was escorted out of the courtroom in cuffs, wrists low at her sides, steps slow and resigned. Outside, reporters waited. They swarmed around the exit, cameras flashing like it was a red carpet event. The moment I stepped out with Leonard, microphones were pushed toward me. "Miss Kane, would you like to say something? Do you feel justice was served? What would you tell other young women in your position?" I paused for just a second. The words came easily, even though I hadn't rehearsed them. She tried to lock me away, I said, but the water rose faster than her lies. Then I kept walking. That night I sat on Leonard's couch wrapped in a blanket that didn't smell like mildew or lavender oil. She made tea, something herbal, nothing fancy, and sat across from me. No words, just company. Noah came over later, bringing a card he made at school. It had a picture of a flood drawn in crayon with stick figures and one speech bubble that said, "I'm glad you're okay." I hung it on the fridge. The courthouse verdict didn't undo the damage. It didn't fix the years of manipulation or give me back the birthdays I spent wondering if I was crazy. But it gave me space to breathe. And that was more than I thought I'd get. Spring came early that year. The air in Baton Rouge softened by March, and the damp heaviness that used to sit in my chest whenever I walked outside had started to lift. It had been 1 year since the flood, 1 year since the lock, 1 year since the truth cracked open and refused to be buried again. The house I lived in now wasn't big. It didn't have polished floors or matching appliances. The walls were uneven in places, and the guest bathroom door stuck every time it rained. But it was safe. It was mine. I lived with Aunt Lena on the edge of town, close enough to hear the highway, but far enough that I could sleep through the night without headlights dancing across the ceiling. My bedroom had 2 windows that stayed open most days and a lock on the inside I had installed myself, not because I needed it, but because I chose to. That room became something I never thought I'd have again, a place no one tried to rewrite who I was. On most mornings I'd wake to the smell of coffee and Lena humming some old Motown tune as she made her tea. She never hovered, never asked too many questions, just existed, steady and warm, like a grounding cord I didn't know I needed. That morning, as sunlight streamed through the curtains, I decided it was time to finish going through the last box from the old house, the one labeled Eliza's Things, scribbled in Sharpie across the side. It had sat untouched in the corner of my closet for months. I'd moved it twice, once when I reorganized my bookshelf, and again when I needed space for winter coats, but I hadn't opened it. Not until now. I pulled it onto the floor, exhaling as I cut the old packing tape. The cardboard flaps gave easily. On top were birthday cards, half still in their envelopes, signed in Mom's looping cursive, "Love you always, even when you're being difficult." One had a $5 bill still tucked inside. Below that were school awards, most improved, perfect attendance, outstanding effort. None of them had ever made it to the wall. I smiled wryly, brushing dust off the corners. Then I found it, a plain, wrinkled envelope. No stamp, no return address, just my name in uneven pencil strokes. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet, faded with time. "If I disappear, please look for me. I wouldn't leave you. I promise." I stared at it for a long time. I remembered writing it, maybe 7 years old, hiding under the dining table while Sable screamed at Mom for not buying the right yogurt. I had felt invisible even then, like my voice was too soft for that house. I tucked the note into my journal next to the page I'd copied from the one they'd found in the basement. Somehow those 2 scraps of paper carried the whole arc of my life, who I was and who I refused to be anymore. Later that day I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and a bowl of leftover gumbo. I hadn't planned to go looking, but curiosity crept in while I scrolled through local news. I found it by accident, a real estate article about recent foreclosures in the area. The Kane house was listed, empty, abandoned, grass growing too high in the front, mold warnings posted on the door. There was a photo of the living room. It had clearly been taken for evidence. Behind the cracked mantel was a family portrait, Mom, Sable, and Noah. I wasn't in it. Not cropped out, just never included. The date stamp said it was taken 3 years ago. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I just closed the tab. That night I stood in front of a room full of folding chairs and women who looked just like I had, tired, cornered, and desperate for a story that didn't end with defeat. It was my first time speaking to a trauma support group organized by the local women's shelter and hosted at the community library. There were no cameras, no reporters, just people. I started simply. "My name is Eliza Kane," I said, holding the microphone loosely. "And 1 year ago I nearly drowned in a house I was supposed to feel safe in." The room held its breath. "I was locked in a basement during a flood," I continued. They called it an accident. She called it a misunderstanding. But I knew better. I didn't list every moment. I didn't need to. I spent years being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too unstable. But the truth. I let the silence sit a moment longer. The truth has a way of floating back up, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. A woman in the back nodded slowly. Another reached for a tissue. I used to think survival meant staying quiet, I said. But now I know it means speaking when it's hardest. I ended with the line I'd been writing and rewriting in my journal for weeks. They tried to trap me in silence, but I turned that silence into a voice. Afterward, a few women came up to thank me. One gave me a hug and whispered, "I didn't know anyone else ever wrote letters like that." On the ride home, Leonard didn't say much. She just turned the radio low and handed me a bottle of water. "You did good, kid," she finally said at a red light. I smiled. I didn't feel scared. You didn't look scared. Back home, I curled up in bed with my journal in my lap. The same journal that once held my fear now held my freedom. I flipped to the last page, pressed the pen against the paper, and whispered to no one but myself. Some wounds stay, but so do I. Sometimes the people we fear most aren't strangers. They're the ones who share our last name. Eliza's story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from justice served in court, but from reclaiming your own voice after years of silence.